Alright, hopefully this video is going to work and we'll be able to talk about the first Red Scare at the end of World War I. We call it the first Red Scare because when we get to the end of World War II, we'll talk about another one. And just as a heads up, when you get on later tests, say an end of semester exam or an end of course test, if the question refers to the Red Scare, it's talking about that one after World War II, the more famous one. This one is usually denoted by either calling it the first Red Scare, the Red Scare immediately after World War I, or maybe they'll give it a year, the Red Scare of 1919, 1920, 1921, somewhere around in there. So that's what we're looking at today, to give you an idea of why people all of a sudden had these fears right on the heels of what in theory would have been a happy time, the end of World War I. Okay, so right after the war, here's what's going on and some of the things that help lead to the Red Scare. First thing is the military was demobilized. Now what that means is that soldiers and sailors are going to be discharged and they're going to be sent back into the civilian population. We typically have a fear of standing armies in the United States. So this was normal. You know, you build up the army for the war, and then as soon as the war's over, you try to get everybody out as quickly as possible. Well, the thing is, these soldiers are coming back into civilian life, and they're now looking for jobs. And so, in the short run, you have an increase in unemployment, and all these guys are out looking for work. At the same time, businesses are going to be returning to normal after the war. Okay, those wartime government boards and agencies were eliminated. The War Labor Board, probably for workers, was the most important government agency. Well, it was eliminated, and a lot of the wartime restrictions were taken off of business. So the businesses are looking at the aftermath of World War I, saying, okay, now we can get back to making more profit. We can increase our profits. In case of the railroads, the owners get the railroads back. And so they're looking at how they can increase profits. And for businesses, one of the ways you increase profit is by cutting your costs. And again, for businesses, any business, their biggest cost is going to be labor. And so the businesses, now that they're getting back to normal, are going to be looking at trying to lower wages back to where they had been before World War I. They may not think they're going to get all the way there, but they're at least going to try to, get some of what they had given labor back here at the end. So there's those increased labor tensions. There's also increased racial tension in the United States immediately after the war. Okay? During the war, African Americans had moved to the north and taken those jobs, and this is what we call the Great Migration, the movement of tens of thousands of African Americans from the south to the north, drawn there by the promise of jobs that were freely available during the war. Well, now that the war is over, a lot of those African Americans are going to be laid off, and they're laid off for various reasons. One is just the fact that businesses are going to be converting back to civilian production, and so maybe they're cutting out positions that they don't need anymore because they're not having to make anything for the military. Also, a huge part of it is just increased competition for jobs. You've got people coming back, so who's going to work for less now? But then it's also racism. These guys were hired because there weren't white people available. Those guys were serving the military. Well, now that the white guys are back, we're going to lay off the black guys because you are black. Okay? So there is racism that also plays a part of that. Now, also up north, because of the Great Migration, the demographics of the cities had changed. What that means is suddenly African Americans make up noticeable percentages of the people in the northern cities. Okay? Noticeable or statistically significant. 1% of the population fitting a certain demographic characteristic, we probably don't notice that. But because of the Great Migration, African Americans in some of the northern cities now make up, 10, 15, 20% of the population. And that's a huge demographic change, which socially shocks the system. Wait a minute, where did this happen? If you have that kind of change, there is a period where people look at that and go, what's going on? This is strange. This is foreign to us some way. And so for the people in the North, when they all of a sudden, there's huge percentages of African Americans, they start thinking, well, how is this going to play out? What are we going to do? And a lot of the northern cities start actually implementing segregation. Some of those are done through law. A lot of it is actually done by that de facto segregation, that custom or tradition. Society just says, okay, we're going to do this. For example, in Chicago, where this cartoon comes from, Chicago had a public beach there next to the lake, and someone actually put up a rope across the beach, separating the white section of the beach from the black section of the beach. Now, because of the Great Migration, because of World War I, which the United States had fought to defend democracy and to spread the values of freedom and equality, African Americans are going to start demanding things, and these are not outrageous demands. They wanted better jobs. They wanted political power. They wanted their civil rights and so on. They're fighting for these things in the North and the South. In the North, they probably have better abilities to fight for these things because of that political power. In the South, they're still dealing with Jim Crow. But still, in the South, even though they were dealing with that, they were still calling for these things and demanding these things. And all this tension is going to boil over in the summer of 1919. In the summer of 1919, all these whites that have hold of the traditional political and economic power, they're feeling threatened. And all it takes is a rumor or a spark or something to start a race riot. And there will be race riots that occur across the United States, some of the major cities, some cities that we might not even think of as being major. But there were huge riots that lasted for days and involved, dozens, maybe even hundreds of people killed and injured. Some of the big riots in 1919, one of the first one was in Longview, Texas, in East Texas. There was a major riot in Chicago that started because of that beach that was segregated. Some African-American boys were swimming. They were on the African-American side of the lake, if you can imagine the lake being segregated, and they drifted over to the white side. In an effort to get them to move, somebody started throwing rocks, and you can imagine what happens. One of the kids got hit in the head, got knocked unconscious, slipped below the water, and drowned. A fight started on the beach, and next thing you know, it spills over into the city, and there's a week-long race riot. These race riots continued off and on through 1921. They're never going to be as many as there were in 1919. This does not mean that the scale of some of the ones later on wasn't even bigger. One of the biggest race riots occurred in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921 when Black Wall Street was destroyed. If you remember us talking about that earlier in the course, Black Wall Street was so named because you had hundreds of black-owned businesses and you had thriving African-American middle class that in 1921 was wiped out in the destruction in the race riot of Tulsa. Add to that the labor tension that was going on. Okay? Labor wanted to capitalize on the gains that they'd made during World War I. They didn't want to stop there. They wanted to keep going. Business, we've already said, wanted to reverse those gains. And so in 1919, you also had a large number of strikes. And if you remember again earlier talking about strikes were typically violent back in the day. And so some of the major strikes from 1919 that we want to point out, there was the Seattle General Strike, which involved over 65,000 workers in Seattle. We call it a general strike because instead of it being employees in, say, one business or one type of business, it instead was workers across the city of Seattle, all going on strike to support one another in various industries. There was also the steel strike. This was a nationwide steel strike. Over 350,000 steel workers walk off the job and went on strike. The most well-known of the strikes of 1919 was the Boston police strike. Maybe it's the most infamous of the strikes because the police went on strike. Now, the governor of Massachusetts, Calvin Coolidge, he's going to make a reputation for himself during the Boston police strike when he orders all the police to go back to work. He tells them there is no right to strike against the public interest. Essentially, your job is protecting the public. You can't go on strike because that puts the public in danger. And he actually fired the police that would not return to work. And, in the short run, you look at, doesn't this create a field day for criminals? Well, yes, but police in surrounding areas that are probably being paid less anyway than they would be in Boston can apply for those jobs and get them. And the police that have been laid off in Boston are now going to be able to fill those jobs in the surrounding places where they're going to end up making less money. Okay? The whole Boston police strike is important because it sets up, I want to call it a rule. It's not truly a rule, but it's this idea that public employees cannot go on strike. Okay? And I have the asterisk there because even though it's the idea that it puts the public at risk, there are many exceptions to this. For example, in the state of Texas, there is actually a law that says teachers cannot go on strike. That is not the law everywhere else. There have been instances, plenty of instances in the United States of teachers going on strike. New Hampshire, West Virginia, Denver, Chicago. It does happen. But because we're public employees in the state of Texas says no. But the idea that the police or doctors or someone else going on strike, putting the public at risk. And the thing all three of these strikes have in common is that they all fail. Most of the strikes are going to fail during 1919. Part of the reason is the public became less supportive of labor. Okay? There is this thing called the Red Scare. A Red Scare is a fear of communism and communist subversion and communist revolution. Okay? See, what had happened to cause this was the Communist Revolution in Russia in 1917. Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto in the middle of the 1800s, where he said that the workers will eventually rise up and overthrow the leaders, the bourgeoisie. And for decades, communists had been kind of waiting on this to happen. Maybe a communist revolution would start and then it would be defeated. Well, finally, in Russia in 1917, one of them works. And around the world, communists kind of took heart. Oh, look, it does work. And so after World War I in Europe, there were some communist revolutions in Eastern and Southern Europe. Now, they all failed. But also in the United States, something happens in 1919. And so we already have kind of the fear of this communist revolution. And then in April of 1919, the post office discovers several dozen mail bombs that had been sent to important politicians and business leaders around the country. J.P. Morgan was a target. The mayor of Seattle, who had opposed the Seattle General Strike, he was a target. And so there's over 30 of these mail bombs that are found, and they're all packaged the same. They all seem the same. It indicates that there is some kind of conspiracy going on. In June, there was a series of bombings that occurred across the country. There were 8 bombs that went off. And again, they're nearly simultaneous. So again, you have this sense of this is a conspiracy. Right? One of them targeted the Attorney General of the United States again. He and his family were in the back of the house when the bomb exploded. But the bomb was powerful enough that it destroyed their house. They had to leave. The house had to be torn down because of the damage that had been done. And so as a result, people are afraid, and government is going to start investigating. The government uses these things called the Palmer Raids. The Palmer Raids are named for the Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, the guy who was targeted in one of those bombings in June. He was an anti-communist, anti-radical, and he ordered this group called the General Intelligence Division, which is a government agency that now is known as the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But at that point, it was the General Intelligence Division. It was led by a guy named J. Edgar Hoover directly. And Palmer orders him to go in and raid groups that are suspected of radicalism. A lot of these raids were conducted without warrants. So in theory, we would look at that and say, well, that's a violation of the Fourth Amendment, a violation against illegal search and seizure. Well, this was an emergency. This was a Red Scare. We must protect the American people from these things. And the courts allowed these warrantless searches. This picture is the aftermath of a search of a Union headquarters. The results of the raids were over 4,000 arrests for people suspected of being radicals or having ties to radicals. Of those that were arrested, some were recent immigrants to the United States, and so they weren't actually citizens yet. And because they weren't citizens, we had over 550 deportations. Here, this cartoonist shows us the vicious aliens, as he puts it. Maybe he's trying to denote, hey, there are aliens, there are immigrants to the country that aren't vicious, but here he's showing the vicious aliens being deported. And they were sent back mostly to Eastern and Southern Europe. Because of this Red Scare, there's also an increase in nativism. We have talked about nativism before. Nativism is that preference for native-born people or a dislike of immigrants. A lot of the radicalism from 1919 was linked to the new immigrants simply because of the stuff that happened in Europe after World War I, those attempted communist revolutions. And so a lot of people thought that you had these two situations. The first here, Lady Liberty welcoming anyone who's oppressed, and yet European anarchists taking advantage of that to come take away our liberty. And a lot of people demanded immigration restrictions against undesirable immigrants. And here you see the classic bomb with the fuse lit, allowing someone we don't like to come in. Okay. The other thing, though, is that these people were also additional competition for jobs. Probably the most infamous case of nativism is the case of Sacco and Vanzetti. Sacco and Vanzetti were Italian immigrants living in Massachusetts. They were accused of murder. Vanzetti worked at a shoe factory. Sacco was a known labor organizer. Businesses and the political rulers would say they were labor radicals or labor agitators. And they were accused of murder. The evidence was extremely circumstantial. Okay? In this day and age, if a prosecutor brought this type of evidence into a courtroom, there's no way he could get a conviction. But in this case, you had a judge who was opposed to immigration. You had prosecutors who were opposed to immigrants, and they essentially labeled these guys as immigrants from Southern Europe, radicals, communists, anarchists. And due to prejudice, they were found guilty, and ultimately they were executed. Now, obviously, not everybody agreed with this. If we look over here on the cartoon on the left, this cartoonist said, this was the death of liberty. When Sacco and Vanzetti were sentenced to death. This over here was on the right is the funeral procession for Sacco and Vanzetti after their execution. And you see literally thousands of people lining the streets who did not agree with what had happened to them. Now, Congress, in this period of heightened nativism and Red Scare, Congress is going to move to restrict immigration. And there were two laws that came out as a result of this nativism and this Red Scare. The first one is the Emergency Quota Act. Congress decided they had to restrict immigration, and so they had to move quickly. And so they called the Emergency Quota Act because we're going to do this now, and then we'll study what we should do later. But they went back to the census of 1910, and on the census you have to put down what is your ethnicity. And they said, okay, how many people of each ethnic group live here in 1910? And they set a quota, a limit, on how many people of each ethnic group could move here every year from that point on, and they limited that to 3% of whatever that ethnic population was in 1910. So let us assume there were 1 million Polish people in the United States in 1910. 3% of that is approximately 30,000. And so from now on, only 30,000 Polish people may move here per year. Okay? This is what they're trying to do. If you think of immigration as already being difficult for people to funnel into the United States, they're trying to insert something to cut it off, to make it even smaller, to shove those numbers down even further. Now, the other thing about the Emergency Quota Act is it also limited immigration to a maximum of 375 immigrants per year. So it didn't matter what your ethnic group was at that point. If you were number 375,001, you weren't coming here, even if there was room for your ethnic group. After taking a couple of years to study it, Congress goes and revised the law, and they passed something called the National Origins Act. The National Origins Act started with the ethnic population of 1890. If you think back to the Gilded Age notes on the new immigrants who didn't start coming over until 1890, we now have a smaller number. Not only are we going to take a smaller number, we're also going to take a smaller percentage of that number. And so immigration was now limited to 2% of whatever the ethnic population was in 1890. And so you might have 1,000 Polish people in the United States in 1890. Now we're only going to take 2%, which becomes 20. Now this law also specifically exempted the Western Hemisphere from those limits. So if you were from somewhere in the Americas, you're able to move. This is not because we like people coming from the Americas and, oh, these people will be like us and democratic. It's because at that point in time, there weren't a whole lot of people moving. And so there wasn't a nativist reaction against people coming from Central and South America because the nativists didn't see them. Once they did see them, then the nativists would have a problem with it. I hope that worked. I hope you're able to get the notes and get ready for your next test.